As it turns out, acetylsalicylic acid is aspirin. And aspirin is one of a class of compounds called analgesics. And analgesics are drugs that relieve pain. And so if you look here at the three most common analgesics, we have aspirin, ibuprofen, and acetaminophen. These three drugs are the most common drugs sold as over-the-counter as an analgesic. And again, we can see that the actual bottle that they're in, all of these bottles that you see here are made of high-density polyethylene. So the bottle itself is an organic compound that's been engineered called high-density polyethylene to give the characteristics that we need to package the medicine in. And then each small molecule here, which looks more complicated perhaps than the polyethylene, they're very small, but they've got these different functional groups that are going to cause each one to have a slightly different physiological effect. So what we're going to do is look closely at these three molecules, aspirin, ibuprofen, and acetaminophen, and see if we can figure out what it is about the molecules, the functional groups on the molecules, that makes each one have a slightly different physiological effect. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at this exercise from the book. And it says, look at the structural formulas in figure 10.7, and figure 10.7 is just this picture right here, and identify the structural features and functional groups that aspirin, ibuprofen, and acetaminophen have in common. Well, the first thing you'll notice is they all have a benzene ring, and we can call this a phenyl group or a benzene ring. It doesn't matter, we're referring to the same thing, but anyway, all three of them have this benzene ring or this phenyl group. Okay. And then if you look at the functional groups on the various molecules, aspirin, of course, has a carboxylic acid functional group right here and an ester functional group right here. The ibuprofen has just one functional group, and that is the carboxylic acid functional group. And then the acetaminophen doesn't have an ester or a carboxylic acid, but it has an alcohol functional group and it has an amide functional group. Okay, and so there are some similarities and there's some differences in these three molecules. So to understand a little bit better why these three drugs have slightly different physiological effects, let's take a little bit of a closer look and uncover how aspirin works. Okay, so how does aspirin itself work? Well, as it turns out, there's really two ways that messages are sent in the body, basically. There's the chemical messaging, and that's normally handled with hormones, and then there's the nerve messages. Nerve messages is where electrical impulses are sent throughout the body to send messages, but actually nerve messages are less efficient than chemical messages because you always have to route through the spinal cord and the brain, and the nerve endings have to actually go all the way to the cell or organ that's going to receive the message. But the chemical messages is much more complicated but much more efficient method of communication within the body. So one chemical messaging system is hormones. There's a whole class of small molecules in the body called hormones. And in general, what will happen is a gland, a particular gland, whether it be your thyroid gland or your adrenal gland or your pancreas, will release hormones upon some other chemical signaling that has occurred, and then the hormones will move throughout the body and cause other biochemical changes to occur. For example, insulin. I think everybody's probably heard of insulin. That's a small protein. It's a hormone, and insulin is released from the pancreas. And what happens is the pancreas, cells in the pancreas will get a message that the glucose level in your blood is above a certain concentration, and the pancreas will release the insulin, which will travel through the bloodstream. So if you pretend like this is insulin, travel all through the bloodstream and be distributed to all over your body, to different cells for all the different parts of your body. And the insulin will then bind to certain membrane-bound receptors, and that binding of the insulin will cause another channel across the cell to open and allow the glucose to be taken up by cells. Okay, so insulin is a hormone that regulates the uptake of glucose in cells. All right, and so if somebody has, for example, type 1 diabetes, then they don't produce insulin in their body anymore, and so they have to, obviously the glucose cannot be taken up in the cells unless the cell has been signaled to take up the glucose. That's why people who have type 1 diabetes have to take insulin daily and they have to try to regulate their insulin with how they eat to artificially cause those cells to open up and allow the glucose in. Okay, so that's one type of messenger. Now, we're really interested today, however, in general how aspirin works and other analgesics of the same class. And they work in, it's a chemical messaging system, but it's slightly different. What happens with the aspirin is it interferes with the production of prostaglandins. Okay, prostaglandins are small molecules that that send messages throughout the body, and they oftentimes will send a message to cause another hormone to be released. So prostaglandins themselves aren't hormones, but they are part of the chemical messaging system. All right, and prostaglandins are really kind of cool because whereas hormones have to be synthesized in particular glands, prostaglandins are synthesized all over the body, wherever they're needed. And what happens is the way a prostaglandin, which is a chemical messenger, is produced is as a result of some sort of cellular damage, whether it be attacked by a bacteria or a virus or some, trauma of some sort. When there's any kind of damage going on in a cell, the cell will release arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is an acid that's found in phospholipids in the cell membrane, because the cell membranes are made of lipids, lipid bilayer, and so this fatty acid, arachidonic acid, is one of the fatty acids on a phospholipid group. And so anyway, it'll be released, and there's a special enzyme, a class of enzymes, actually it's not just one, it's a class of enzymes called cyclooxygenases, or they're abbreviated COX, COX. It's a class of enzymes that catalyzes the synthesis of prostaglandins from the arachidonic acid. So prostaglandins actually look a lot like a fatty acid. The arachidonic acid has just been changed. And there's lots of different prostaglandins, and they have lots of different jobs. But one of the jobs of one type of prostaglandin is upon its formation, it signals other biochemical changes around the damaged cell to retain water, which causes swelling. This is trying to kind of partition off the damaged area. That would happen like if you have an infection, or if you've, broken your arm or sprained your ankle or whatever. So you can have swelling. Other prostaglandins cause fever, because fever, increasing the temperature of your body, can kill off some bacteria and viruses. And also pain. It increases the sensitivity of pain receptors, so that there's something wrong with that part of your body and you'll tend to it. Okay, so it's really an amazing chemical chain of events, the prostaglandins, that is, of how this simple little fatty acid is converted to prostaglandins, which then send all these chemical signals. Alrighty. So anyway, why am I talking about all this? Because aspirin, how does aspirin work? The way aspirin works is it actually binds to the active site of some of these cyclooxygenase enzymes. And if it binds to the active site is where arachidonic acid should be binding. But if aspirin binds instead, then the prostaglandin can't be produced, and so therefore you limit the swelling, the fever, and the pain. Alrighty, so that's how aspirin works. So somehow it is binding to a receptor, or to the active site of the COX enzyme.